All right, follow along on your scratch paper for the Math on the Spot video.
Okay, now I think I have this design all sewn up. Sewn up, it's a hat after all. Oh, hi, how are you? I was just designing actually a new hat that I wanted to have as a baseball hat. And in fact, you can check it out for yourself. Have a look at it. Isn't that nice? I designed it for myself. I think it's coming along. It's going to be dark. It's got these nice gold letters. I think it's going to look really neat, really neat. And actually, you know what? This reminds me of a great math riddle that will allow us to actually write an equation where we have a bunch of variables. And it's going to be interesting. In this case, we're going to have two types of variables. We're going to have variables that are called dependent variables and variables that are called independent variables. Independent variables mean that they can be just about anything at all. But once they're tethered down, then they will determine the dependent variables. A dependent variable is an unknown that depends upon other unknowns. Let's take a look at the example that I have in mind and see if we can use that to illustrate this really interesting and very important idea. Here we go. Coach Diaz is buying hats for the baseball team, kind of like what I'm doing right here. Now, the total cost, which we're going to call C, is equal to the number of hats that he buys, let's call it N, times the sum of the price per hat, we'll call that H, and a $2 charge per hat to have the team name embroidered on it. Let's see if we can write an equation that can be used to find the cost of the hats. Now, I'm going to be totally honest with you. When we first hear these kind of questions, it sounds like, oh my goodness, I don't understand anything. We've got to break it down. If you take it piece by piece and almost word by word and work your way up to sentence by sentence, all of a sudden we can figure it out. It's all there. It's just a matter of us decoding it. Let's try to decode it together. So let's just think of what we have. C represents the cost of the hats that he's going to buy, the total cost. So I'm going to write that here and say C represents the total cost. Okay, great. Now N represents the number of hats that he's going to buy. Okay, so N represents the number of hats that Coach Diaz is actually going to buy. H is going to be the cost that he has to pay per hat. Okay, so whatever the cost of the actual hat is, we're going to call that H. And then, once he buys the hat, we have to have the SU, in my case, sewn into it, and so that's going to be an additional charge per hat of $2. So you see how I'm trying to actually just get down these basic ideas. C is going to be the total cost of the whole order. N is the number of hats he's going to order. H is the price of the hat itself. And then $2 is going to be added to that price in order to have the SU put on. Okay, so what's an equation that can be used to find the cost of the hats? Well, if we think about it, the cost of the hat, whoops, I didn't like to do that. The cost of the hat would be equal to C. So the cost, total cost, equals. And now we have to actually figure out what the rule is. So what we were told is that the total cost C is equal to the number of hats, that's N, times the sum of something. So the number of hats, that's going to be N, times the sum of the price per hat plus the $2 service charge. So times the sum of the price per hat plus the $2. Now that might seem like a great guess. This is the formula, but it's not quite right. Can you see why it's wrong? There's something that's missing here. Remember, he's supposed to multiply N times the sum of H plus 2. Let me give you a second right now and see if you can see what needs to be added to this equation to actually make it correct. I'll give you a hint. They're curvy. Well, if we're going to multiply N by the sum, we have to lasso that sum. So the curvy things missing were those parentheses to make sure that we take the charge per hat, add the $2, and that's the total price, the total cost for one hat, and then we multiply it by the number of hats sold. Without the parentheses, we are taking the number of hats and multiplying it by the cost of each hat, and then adding on just one $2 for the entire order, when in fact we have to add on $2 for every single one of the hats. That's what the parentheses do. Now, in this case, we can look at this and ask, what are the independent and what are the dependent variables? Well, the independent variables, actually, are going to be the price and the number. Those are just things that are given to us by the external world. The store tells us the price, and the number of students that show up that want to buy a hat, that will determine the number. So the number of hats and the price are examples of dependent variables. Dependent variables. Now, on the other hand, once I know those, I can insert them into this expression, and that will give me the cost. So the cost is determined by knowledge of how many hats and the price of each hat. So this depends on these. These are independent, but this is dependent. And so this one is, in fact, the dependent variable. So this is, this is the, these are independent. Why did I write dependent? Why did you let me write that? This should be independent. Independent. It doesn't depend on anything. Those are the given things. But this is the dependent one, the dependent. Why did you let me write that? Variable. Making mistakes, of course, is good. So I guess I'm not too upset. So this depends upon our knowledge of these two. These can be anything. Any number of hats can be ordered at any price. But once I know the number of hats and once I know the price, that will then determine the cost. So this is dependent because it depends on this. Do you see that? So that is the difference between independent variables and dependent variables. The independent variables can really be anything, but once I know them, they will determine the dependent variables. Once I know the number of hats you want to order, and once I know how much each hat costs, I can determine the cost. And so therefore the cost is a dependent variable. Well, here we see a wonderful equation that allows us, in fact, to appreciate how to figure out the cost of this order. It really is just going to come down to knowing the number of hats to be ordered and how much each hat is going to cost. We put that together, and that will always produce the dependent variable of the cost. Producing an equation which has independent variables and a dependent variable is extremely important. It basically is the mathematical analog of cause and effect. And that's what we're seeing here. And really, all of math is built on cause and effect. In fact, all of the world is built on that. So in fact, in the world of ideas, there are the independent and the dependent variables. And once we understand them, all of a sudden, worlds open up. Enjoy thinking about the worlds around you, both the dependent and the independent, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.